In the early hours of November 15, 2021, a terrified mother and daughter clutched a phone, whispering into the receiver as footsteps echoed outside their home. "He has a gun," the daughter warned, her voice trembling, urgent. Within minutes, everything would change. The home in Antioch, Tennessee would fall silent, except for the ringing shell casings and the screams of a mother who had just watched her child take her last breath. But what led to that moment wasn't sudden. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was the heartbreaking end to a series of warnings ignored, dismissed, and eventually paid for with a life. Before we begin, if you care about real-life stories that deserve to be heard, stories that demand attention, make sure to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let's get into it. Michaela Carter was just 24 years old. To anyone who knew her, she was full of life. A devoted Christian, she carried her faith with grace in her smile, in how she treated people, and in how she saw the world. She wasn't just kind, she was magnetic. Whether it was at her church, her job, or even in passing conversations with strangers, Michaela left people feeling seen and heard. That's what made her marriage to James J. Leggett so confusing to those around her. They had met in high school in 2007, starting out as just friends. At first, James seemed quiet, a little reserved but attentive. He listened to Michaela like every word she spoke mattered. Things moved fast. They appeared happy, at least to the outside world. On social media, they shared pictures together, smiling, embracing, and celebrating milestones. In public, James gave her a lot of attention. To friends and acquaintances, they looked like a young couple in love, building something special. Within months, they were living together. And before the year was over, they were married. But soon the charm turned into control. James didn't like Michaela talking to other men, not co-workers, not classmates, not even longtime family friends. At first he'd joke about it. Then he started questioning her every move. Michaela, raised in faith and taught to see the good in everyone, tried to make it work. She prayed. She forgave. She stayed. But behind closed doors, James wasn't just jealous. He was angry, possessive, unpredictable. His own life didn't seem steady. He had trouble keeping jobs. Didn't have many close friends. Some described him as distant, others as unpredictable. Those closest to Michaela began to notice a change in her. She smiled less. She stopped going out. She became quiet about her home life. But when she did open up, it was to her mother and close friends. And what she shared was alarming. In July of 2021, James reportedly struck her with a glass bottle. The details were graphic. But the impact was deeper than physical. Michaela filed for an order of protection. A formal plea to keep him away. A boundary one she never wanted to have to draw. But still, she didn't hate him. She didn't speak of him with anger. If anything, she hoped. She believed people could change. So she stayed cautious but not bitter. Her days moved on, but the weight never left. She was trying to live her life, get back to normal, but the fear lingered. James, meanwhile, wasn't done. He would send texts, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusing. He'd show up near places she visited. At times he'd stay quiet for weeks, then suddenly reappear. Michaela's heart stayed heavy. She was trying to walk away from a man she once loved, but the shadow he left behind only seemed to grow. And on November 15th, that shadow stepped back into her world, not as a memory but as a man with a loaded weapon, standing just outside her door. Michaela Carter was at home with her mother, Kimberly JonesMbuyi, when James J. Leggett, her estranged husband, appeared outside the house, a direct violation of the order of protection she had filed just 4 months earlier. James didn't knock. He didn't call out. He stood outside, still watching the home. Inside, Michaela's instincts kicked in. She knew he wasn't supposed to be there. She knew there was a court document saying he had to stay away. But most of all, she knew James and how unpredictable he could be. So she picked up the phone and called 911. Her voice was calm at first, but tense. She explained that James was at the door and that he had a weapon. She told the dispatcher there was a protection order on file. Then, with barely enough time to react, her voice sharpened. "He's coming to the door now. He has a gun." The dispatcher acknowledged the urgency and said officers were being sent. But by the time police arrived, James was no longer at the front door. He had moved away from the immediate area. Still, Michaela and her mother met the officers outside and showed them the existing order of protection, including documentation. They even showed text messages James had sent. According to publicly released details from the civil lawsuit filed by Michaela's mother, the officers did not arrest James, even with all that in hand. Instead, the police told Michaela that if she wanted to press charges, she would need to go downtown to the courthouse to complete the process. They offered to escort her to court later that day to file the formal complaint. She agreed, thanking them. Then the officers left. They didn't issue a warrant. They didn't detain James, who was still in the neighborhood. And they didn't stay to monitor the home. They simply got in their vehicle and drove away, even though they had been shown documentation, warnings, and heard the fear in Michaela's voice. Inside, Michaela and her mom locked the door. They stayed near the phone. They may have hoped the worst was over, that the police presence would be enough to keep James away. But tension still sat in the air like smoke that hadn't cleared. The silence outside wasn't comforting. It was too quiet, too sudden. Somewhere nearby, James was still out there, and the next moments would bring a tragedy that not even the most desperate warning could prevent. It was just after 7 a.m. Only minutes after officers left, everything shifted. James J. Leggett returned. This time there was no hesitation. He forced his way through the front door, breaking it down. The noise was immediate and loud, the sound of a wooden frame cracking under pressure. Michaela and her mother were still near the phone. They called 911 again. The fear in their voices this time was unmistakable. In the background of the emergency call, footsteps moved quickly. There was panic. Words rushed together. Then gunshots. James opened fire inside the home. Michaela was struck in the chest and the leg. She had been trying to protect her mother, placing herself between the shooter and the only parent she had. Kimberly later told officials that her daughter shielded her. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood in the way. That was Michaela, always protecting others, even at her own risk. The line with 911 stayed open, but the sounds that followed were heartbreaking. What happened inside that house in those final seconds left behind more than bullet holes and broken glass. It left a family destroyed. Michaela was rushed to the hospital. Doctors tried to save her. But the damage was too severe. She died from her injuries. She was 24. Her mother survived physically, but emotionally the wounds were deep and permanent. She had witnessed her daughter, someone she raised, someone she prayed with, laughed with, fought for, take her final breath. And she did so after asking for help, after following the law, after doing everything she could to stay safe. Michaela's final words have never been made public, but those who heard the 911 recording said the fear, the urgency, and the heartbreak were impossible to ignore. Her life was taken in the very place she should have felt most safe. And it all happened within 10 minutes of the police leaving her home after being shown a protection order and messages that spoke for themselves. The weight of that moment didn't just fall on her mother. It echoed across the city and into the headlines. Because this wasn't just a loss. It was a question left unanswered. How could someone do everything right, call for help, seek protection, and still be failed in the most permanent way? The days after Michaela Carter's death were filled with grief but also with questions. Kimberly JonesMbuyi, her mother, had watched everything unfold from the first 911 call to the moment Michaela took her final breath. And what haunted her most wasn't just the loss. It was knowing that it could have been prevented. She had stood by while her daughter called the police. She had heard Michaela explain the protection order. She had seen the officers walk away. So, in the weeks that followed, Kimberly made a decision not just to mourn but to act. She filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Metro Nashville Police Department, citing negligence and failure to protect her daughter, despite clear warnings. The suit laid out the facts plainly. Michaela had followed the law. She had reported her fears. She had asked for help and help didn't come. The lawsuit sparked public outrage. Michaela's story spread throughout the city, picked up by local news and national outlets. People questioned how an active protection order, a detailed 911 call, and physical evidence weren't enough for officers to act. In response to the growing pressure, The city reached a settlement with Kimberly for $250,000. But money wasn't the goal. What mattered more were the policy changes that followed. The Metro Nashville Police Department implemented two major reforms. Officers would now be required to activate body cameras during all domestic violence calls. A BOLO, be on the lookout, alert would be issued immediately if a suspect violated a protection order. No delays, no discretion. An internal review was also launched to assess how officers handled Michaela's case. The findings confirmed what many feared, that department policies had been violated. One officer was disciplined, but only with a 2-day suspension. For many, including Kimberly, that felt painfully inadequate. A daughter had been lost. A home had been shattered. And the response was a brief administrative action that seemed to fade quietly into the background. Meanwhile, James J. Leggett, the man charged with Michaela's killing, was indicted for first-degree murder and multiple weapons offenses. But he never stood trial. On July 4, 2024, Leggett died while in custody, awaiting trial. Details surrounding his death were limited. What remained was the unfinished chapter, the part of the story where he might have faced judgment in court, where answers might have been found. With his death, there would be no cross-examination, no courtroom apology, no sentence handed down. What was left instead was a mother still holding on to her daughter's memory, and a city forced to reckon with how easily protection can become just paperwork if no one enforces it. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed. From loss into purpose. From grief into resolve. Kimberly had buried her daughter, but she refused to bury the truth. Michaela Carter lived her 24 years with purpose. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a believer. Her Christian faith was central to her identity, not just in name or habit, but in how she carried herself every day. She was known for her kindness, her willingness to forgive, and her desire to help others. She left a lasting impression not through grand gestures, but through steady grace. Her life was full of promise. And after her death, that same light didn't vanish, it ignited a movement. Across Tennessee and beyond, Michaela's story reignited conversations that too often fade into silence. Conversations about domestic violence, about how protection orders are enforced, and about the gaps that can cost lives when systems fail. People began asking harder questions. Why wasn't James Leggett arrested when police were at the door? What does protection mean if it can't guarantee safety? What responsibility do officers carry when a life is placed in their hands and lost? For Kimberly JonesMbuyi, these weren't just questions. They were fuel. She continued to speak publicly, sharing her daughter's story not for sympathy, but for change. Her voice joined others calling for stronger enforcement of protective orders and better domestic violence response protocols. Her lawsuit had led to a settlement, but her fight wasn't about the money. It was about making sure no other mother had to watch what she did. No other daughter had to call for help and be ignored. In early 2025, legal scholars began analyzing the implications of Kimberly JonesMbuyi v. Metro. At the heart of the appellate ruling was a critical question. When constitutional protections are violated, who speaks for the victim and what role should the state play in that process? The debate sparked legal reflection across Tennessee and set a precedent for how state intervention and survivor rights might evolve in the future. Through it all, Michaela's name remained at the center, not as a headline, but as a reminder. A reminder that this wasn't just a legal case or a tragic news story. This was a human life. A woman with dreams, faith, and people who loved her. Her story has become more than a warning. It's a symbol. A symbol of what can happen when systems fall short. A symbol of what one mother's courage can ignite. And a symbol of the change one life can still make, even after it's been taken far too soon. If you care about justice and real-life stories that matter, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Every story we tell is real and every voice deserves to be heard. Michaela Carter's story isn't just a headline, it's a wake-up call. If you believe stories like hers deserve to be told and heard, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe. You're helping keep their memory alive.